A little black girl named Maya stepped onto the plane with her mother, her eyes sparkling with excitement as she clutched her favorite stuffed bear tightly in her hands. Today was supposed to be a special day. It was their first flight together, and they were going to visit her aunt in Florida for the summer. Maya had been talking about this trip for weeks, imagining all the fun adventures she would have. They walked down the narrow aisle of the plane. Maya was still in awe of the size of the aircraft, the way the rows of seats stretched endlessly down the cabin. It was like a giant metal bird soaring in the sky. Her mother held her hand tightly as they made their way to their assigned seats. Maya had never flown before, and everything felt like an adventure. The hum of the engines, the flight attendants in their crisp uniforms, and the way the people around her seemed so calm and collected in comparison to her bubbling energy. Maya tried to match the mood, but it was hard with all the excitement coursing through her veins. As they approached their seats, Maya's mother turned to her and said, "Sweetie, we'll be sitting here close to the window. You can watch the clouds and see the world from way up high." Maya beamed, her face lighting up at the thought of looking out the window and seeing everything from above. Her tiny hands reached up to help store their bags in the overhead compartment. She wasn't very tall, but she was determined to be a big girl and help her mom with the little tasks. As they settled in, Maya noticed the flight attendants walking past them, their smiles polite but cold, almost like they didn't even see her standing there. She wondered if the attendants would talk to her once they were in the air. After all, this was her first flight, and she was bursting with questions. What did it feel like to be up in the clouds? How did the food taste up here? But she didn't want to interrupt anyone's work, so she kept her excitement to herself. Maya's mother helped her fasten her seatbelt and settled into her own seat. She turned to Maya and smiled sweetly. "Sweetheart, just relax and enjoy the ride." Maya nodded and smiled back, but her excitement was too much to contain. She fidgeted in her seat, eyes darting from one corner of the plane to the other, watching the passengers board and the flight attendants prepare the cabin for takeoff. But as the last few passengers settled into their seats, Maya noticed one of the flight attendants staring at her. The woman had a stern look on her face, and Maya wasn't sure why she was looking at her that way. It made her feel a little uneasy, but she tried to shake it off. Maybe the woman was just busy and had a lot on her mind. As the flight attendant made her way down the aisle again, she paused at Maya's row and stopped right in front of her. The woman looked at Maya with a sharp expression that sent a chill down Maya's spine. It wasn't a friendly smile or a warm greeting. It was more like a look of disapproval, like Maya had done something wrong. Maya shrank back in her seat, unsure of what was happening. She didn't know this woman. Why was she staring at her like that? The flight attendant cleared her throat and said loudly for everyone in the aisle to hear, "Excuse me, but I think you need to move your bag. It's blocking the aisle." Maya froze for a moment. She hadn't even realized that her small backpack had been in the way. It was an accident. She hadn't meant to cause any trouble, but the words the flight attendant spoke were sharp, and her tone was harsher than Maya expected. The mother glanced up from her seat, sensing the tension in the air, but she didn't respond right away. She looked at Maya for a moment, wondering if she had heard correctly. What was going on? Was this really happening? Maya sat there, frozen, unsure of what to do. She looked up at her mother, her eyes wide with confusion. But before her mother could react, the flight attendant was already speaking again, her voice cold and stern. "You need to move that bag now." Maya could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her. It was as if the whole cabin was watching, waiting for her to do something. She glanced down at her backpack, her small hands gripping it tightly. She hadn't meant to cause any trouble, but now she felt all the eyes on her, and her face grew hot with embarrassment. She tried to lift the bag from the floor, but it felt too heavy for her tiny arms. She struggled for a moment, but the flight attendant was impatient and snatched the bag from her hands. It was so sudden Maya flinched as the woman grabbed it and moved it herself. With a forceful motion, the bag slammed into the overhead compartment with a loud thud that made Maya wince. Her heart pounded in her chest. She had never felt so small, so powerless, and in that moment she wanted nothing more than to disappear into the seat. Her mother reached over to her, rubbing her back gently, trying to comfort her. But even that couldn't ease the sting of the flight attendant's harsh words. The woman didn't even look at her. Once she was done with the bag, she simply turned and walked away, as if nothing had happened. But for Maya, it wasn't that simple. The feeling of humiliation stuck with her, like a weight pressing down on her chest. She wanted to speak up, to say something, anything, but the words got caught in her throat. Maya had never experienced anything like this before. It wasn't just the flight attendant's words, it was the way she had spoken to her, the way her presence had felt so cold and dismissive. Maya tried to turn her attention to the window. She focused on the view outside, the tiny sliver of the world below, hoping that looking at the clouds would help her feel better. But no matter how hard she tried, her mind kept drifting back to that moment. The moment when the flight attendant had humiliated her in front of everyone, the moment when she had made Maya feel like she didn't belong here, like she was somehow less than everyone else. Her mother noticed the quiet tears slipping down Maya's cheeks. She leaned over and whispered, "Don't let her make you feel small, sweetie. You're just as important as anyone else." But Maya didn't respond. She just nodded slightly, wiping her face with her sleeve. But deep down she was unsure. Her mother's words were kind, but they didn't erase the sting of the flight attendant's actions. Maya wanted to speak up and tell her mom what had happened, but she was afraid of what might happen if she did. She didn't want to make a scene, and she didn't want to upset her mom even more than she already was, so she kept her thoughts to herself and continued staring out the window, trying to forget the feeling of humiliation that was slowly consuming her. The flight attendant passed by again moments later, but this time she didn't stop in front of their row. Maya tried to ignore her, keeping her gaze focused firmly outside the plane. As the clouds drifted by, her mind raced, but her heart felt heavy with a sense of injustice. Something wasn't right, but Maya didn't know how to make it stop. She just wanted the flight to be over so she could forget about everything that had happened. But deep down, she knew this wouldn't be something she would easily forget. This wasn't just an isolated moment. It was something that had shaken her sense of belonging. Her place in the world felt uncertain now, all because of one cruel moment that had been completely out of her control. As the plane took off and the engines roared to life, Maya leaned against her mother's shoulder, her heart still racing from the confrontation. But no words were spoken between them. Her mother's hand rested gently on her lap, but Maya could feel the weight of her silence. It was a kind of quiet that made everything feel heavier. She wanted to say something to her mom, to let her know what had happened, but the words still wouldn't come out. The rest of the flight attendants moved about the cabin, preparing for the journey ahead. But Maya couldn't stop thinking about the look in the woman's eyes, the coldness of her voice, the way she had made Maya feel like she wasn't welcome on the plane. Her small hands trembled as she clutched her stuffed bear tighter, the comforting fabric of its paws grounding her in a moment of softness. But even the bear couldn't completely take away the feeling that had settled deep in her chest. There was something about being publicly humiliated that made her feel like she was on display, a spectacle for others to watch and judge. As the passengers around her spoke quietly to one another, she felt exposed. She was no longer a little girl excited for a vacation. She was just the girl who had been scolded for no reason at all. Maya stared out the window and tried to calm her racing thoughts as the flight began to level off, and the clouds stretched out beneath them like a sea of cotton candy. She focused on the patterns below, the endless patches of white and blue, trying to lose herself in the beauty of the sky. But it didn't help. She could still hear the sharpness of the flight attendant's voice echoing in her head. She could still see the way the woman's eyes had looked at her with disdain, as if Maya had been nothing more than an inconvenience. The worst part was the feeling that Maya was somehow responsible for the whole thing, like maybe if she had been more careful or had known the right way to do things, she wouldn't have been yelled at in the first place. But she wasn't sure she understood why she had been yelled at all. Her backpack hadn't been in the way. It had been an honest mistake. But the flight attendant didn't seem to care about that. She hadn't cared about Maya's feelings or how humiliated she was in front of all those people. Maya tried to push the thoughts away, but they kept returning each time the plane hit a bump or shifted in the air. She could feel the weight of those words pressing down on her shoulders like a burden she couldn't shake. Her mother still hadn't said anything, and Maya wasn't sure if she should bring it up again. Part of her wanted to pretend like it never happened, as if ignoring it would make the hurt go away. But deep down Maya knew that wasn't the answer. She needed to talk about it. But the fear of making it worse kept her quiet. What if her mother was disappointed? What if she couldn't make sense of it either? Maya had never been in a situation like this before. She had never had to face an adult who treated her like she wasn't important. She had never felt so small in the eyes of a stranger. The longer she sat there, the more she realized that this wasn't just about one rude flight attendant. It was about something bigger. It was about the way people sometimes treated others, like they didn't matter, like their feelings didn't count, like their existence was an inconvenience. Maya wasn't sure how to process it all, but one thing was certain. She didn't like how it made her feel. She didn't like feeling powerless and afraid of speaking up. Something inside of her told her this wasn't right, but she wasn't sure how to fix it, or if she even could. Maya wanted to scream at the injustice, but she didn't know who to scream at. She felt trapped in her seat, unable to escape the overwhelming sadness that had settled in her heart. It was a feeling that stayed with her long after the plane had ascended higher into the clouds. The plane hummed steadily in the sky as Maya sat in her seat, trying to push the humiliation to the back of her mind. But it was hard. The weight of it followed her everywhere. It sat in her chest, like a stone that wouldn't budge. She tried to focus on the scenery outside the window, but all she could see were clouds, and all she could think about was the flight attendant's voice cutting through the calm with sharpness and authority. Maya glanced over at her mom, who was still quietly staring ahead. Her mother had been unusually silent since the incident. Maya wondered if she was upset too, or if maybe she didn't know what to say. She wanted to ask her mom if she had heard what had happened, if she had seen the way the flight attendant treated her, but the words wouldn't come out. Instead, Maya just sat there, feeling smaller and smaller as the minutes dragged on. The gentle hum of the plane felt like a constant reminder of how out of place she now felt in a place that had once seemed so exciting, so full of possibility. She could still feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, as if they were all silently judging her for not standing up for herself, for not defending herself against the flight attendant. The thought made her stomach churn. She didn't want to be the girl who let someone treat her that way. She didn't want to be weak or invisible, but the fear of making things worse held her back. She wasn't sure how to fix it, or if it was even worth fixing. Maybe it was just one rude person, one bad experience. But the more Maya thought about it, the more she realized how wrong it had felt, how unfair it had been. Maya's thoughts were interrupted by a voice behind her. A man who had been sitting across the aisle from them stood up and walked over to the flight attendant, who had humiliated Maya earlier. He was tall, with a strong presence, and he moved quickly toward the flight attendant, as if he knew exactly what he was going to do. Maya watched in shock. As he approached her, he didn't hesitate. He walked right up to the flight attendant and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Excuse me, but you need to apologize to that little girl now." Maya's heart skipped a beat. Her eyes widened as the man's words echoed through the cabin. The flight attendant's face went pale for a moment, and she glanced at Maya, as if she had just realized the full weight of what had happened. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The man didn't back down. He stood there with his arms crossed and looked directly at the flight attendant, his expression unwavering. "You can't treat a child like that," he said, his voice calm but firm. And there was something in his tone that made the entire cabin fall silent. The flight attendant looked at him nervously, then at Maya, and finally back at the man. She opened her mouth again, but it was clear she was at a loss for words. Maya could see the tension in the air. She could feel the other passengers watching, holding their breath, waiting to see how this would play out. Maya's heart pounded in her chest. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but for the first time since the incident, she felt something else besides fear. She felt a flicker of hope, like maybe this could be made right. Maybe someone would stand up for her and say what she was too scared to say herself. The flight attendant stood still for a long moment before she slowly turned toward Maya with an expression that looked almost apologetic. She muttered something under her breath and then said quietly, "I'm sorry." Maya didn't know how to respond. She just stared at the woman, unsure of what to do or say. She wasn't used to people apologizing to her like that, but the apology felt hollow somehow, like it didn't fully erase the hurt. Maya wanted to speak up, but the words were still caught in her throat. Instead, she turned her eyes back to the window, her face burning with a mixture of relief and confusion. What just happened? What was this man doing? Why was he standing up for her? Maya wasn't sure, but she knew one thing for certain. She would never forget this moment. The feeling of someone else fighting for her, even when she felt too small to fight for herself. The silence in the cabin lingered for a few moments after the man's intervention. It was as if everyone was holding their breath, unsure of what would happen next. The flight attendant stood there, frozen, eyes wide, as if she was processing what had just occurred. Maya couldn't bring herself to look back at her. She wasn't sure if she was angry or relieved, or both at the same time, but the feeling in her chest was something different. It was like a small spark had been lit inside her, a sense of empowerment that hadn't been there before. The tension in the air started to fade, and passengers began to quietly talk among themselves. Some whispered to each other, others just stared ahead. But the man who had stood up for her didn't sit down. He remained standing near the front of the aisle with his arms crossed, his eyes never leaving the flight attendant. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't shouted. He had simply spoken out when it mattered most, and in doing so he had made something shift, something inside Maya that she hadn't known she needed. But now she could feel it, a sense of validation that she hadn't realized was missing all this time. The flight attendant muttered an apology again, but this time it felt empty, like she was saying the words out of obligation, and not because she truly understood the gravity of her actions. Maya felt her stomach twist as she watched the woman retreat toward the back of the cabin. But it wasn't over. The man who had intervened was still standing with a look of quiet defiance, and Maya knew that somehow this moment had already changed something in the dynamic of the plane. The flight attendant couldn't undo what had just happened, even if she wanted to. Maya wasn't sure how, but the whole atmosphere had shifted. People no longer seemed indifferent or uncomfortable. They seemed more awake, more aware of what was happening around them, maybe even more willing to speak up if something wasn't right. The man eventually returned to his seat, but Maya couldn't stop thinking about him. She couldn't stop thinking about how one person had changed everything for her just by standing up and speaking out. She looked over at her mother, who had been watching the exchange with a quiet intensity, her face unreadable. Maya wondered if her mom had seen everything, if she had felt the same way Maya had about the whole thing. But her mother said nothing at first. She just gently touched Maya's hand and squeezed it reassuringly. "Sweetie, don't let anyone make you feel small," she whispered, her voice soft but full of meaning. Maya blinked up at her, surprised by the words. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear them, how much she needed to know that her mom was still there for her, that she still had her back, no matter what happened on this flight. Her mother's words were like a balm for the wound the flight attendant had left in Maya's heart. And for the first time since the incident, Maya started to feel a little lighter. She didn't know if she could forget what had happened, but she was beginning to realize that she didn't need to carry the weight of it alone. The man had stood up for her, and her mother was there for her too. In that moment, Maya felt less alone than she had before, like maybe she wasn't as powerless as she thought. Maybe she didn't have to be silent just because someone else made her feel that way. It wasn't just about the apology, it was about the realization that there were people in the world who would stand up for what was right, and that gave her a sense of hope, something she hadn't felt in a long time. She glanced at her mother, once more her heart swelling with gratitude, and whispered, "Thanks, Mom." Her mother smiled softly and gave her hand another gentle squeeze. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind Maya that even when things felt hard, there were people who would always support her, people who would always care. As the flight continued its journey, the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted into something more tense, but not in the way it had been before. Now there was a sense of quiet solidarity, a sense of awareness among the passengers that hadn't been there in the beginning. Maya could feel it in the air, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to happen, waiting to see what came next. The flight attendant, who had humiliated her earlier, was nowhere to be seen. She had disappeared to the back of the plane after the confrontation with the man, and she didn't return to the front for the rest of the flight. Maya didn't know if that was a good thing or a bad thing. She didn't know if the woman was ashamed or if she was avoiding eye contact with anyone out of guilt. But either way, it didn't seem like Maya would have to face her again. Not today, at least. The man who had spoken up for her had long since returned to his seat, and the tension in the cabin had loosened somewhat. But Maya couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something deep inside her that made her think differently about the world around her, about how people treated one another. She still hadn't forgotten the harshness of the flight attendant's words and the way she had made Maya feel. But now there was a new sense of resilience inside of her, a sense of strength she hadn't known she had. She felt like she wasn't just a little girl sitting in a seat waiting for the flight to be over. She felt like she had a voice, like She could stand up for herself if she needed to, but even though the man had done what Maya had been too afraid to do, she couldn't help but wonder if she had done the right thing by staying quiet. If she had done something, maybe it wouldn't have gone that far, maybe the whole thing could have been avoided. But what if the man hadn't said anything? What if he hadn't stood up for her? Would anyone else have spoken up? Would the flight attendant have just walked away and gone on with her job, acting like nothing had happened? Maya didn't know the answer, but the thought gnawed at her. She wanted to believe that people would always do the right thing, that when something was wrong, someone would always step in. But part of her feared that maybe that wasn't true. Maybe it wasn't always that simple. Maybe people were too afraid to act. Maybe they didn't want to make things uncomfortable or draw attention to themselves. Maya glanced around the cabin at the other passengers. Most of them seemed to be going about their business now, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. But Maya knew better. She knew that what had happened wasn't normal, and it wasn't something that should be ignored. She could still feel the sting of the words and the harshness of the flight attendant's gaze, and no matter how many times she tried to push it away, it still lingered at the back of her mind. But the man's words echoed in her head too, his calm assertiveness, his refusal to back down. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Maya felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. There was hope in the fact that people could stand up when it mattered most. There was hope in the fact that one voice could make a difference, even in a small moment, even when it felt like no one was paying attention. Maya closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The quiet hum of the engines and the soft murmur of the passengers around her provided a kind of calm. But the thought of what had happened still pulsed in her chest. She didn't know if she would ever forget it, but she was beginning to understand that what mattered now wasn't the humiliation. What mattered was how she felt about it, how she was going to move forward from here. It wasn't about letting someone make her feel small. It was about standing tall, even when the world around her seemed to want to put her down. The world wasn't perfect, and people weren't always kind, but Maya knew she could be brave. Even when she was afraid, she could speak up. Even when her voice trembled, she had seen someone do it today. And if one person could do it, so could she. The flight finally began its descent into their destination, and as the plane slowly began to lower through the clouds, Maya's stomach twisted with anticipation. They were close to landing now, but the events of the past hours seemed to linger in her mind like a thick fog. She could still feel the weight of the flight attendant's harsh words, still hear the coldness in her voice. But the more Maya thought about it, the more she began to feel something else too, something unexpected. She felt a wave of gratitude for the man who had stood up for her. His actions had made all the difference in the world to her. They had given her a glimpse of something she hadn't considered before, the possibility that there were people out there who would stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult. Maya had always been shy, always careful about speaking up, always worried about causing a scene. But the man's simple words had made her see that it didn't take a lot of noise to make a difference. Sometimes it just took one person with the courage to say something. Maya had never been a particularly outspoken child. She was quiet and observant, and often preferred to keep to herself. But now she couldn't help but wonder what would happen if everyone spoke up when something wasn't right, if everyone stood together in moments of injustice. Would the world be a better place? Would people treat each other with more kindness, with more respect? Maya wasn't sure, but she knew that the world didn't always work that way. Sometimes people stayed silent because they were afraid of what might happen, or because they didn't want to be involved. But that didn't have to be the way it was. Maya didn't know if she was ready to speak up just yet, but she was beginning to feel like maybe she could someday, maybe one day she would find her voice and use it to make a difference. She looked over at her mom, who was staring out the window, her face peaceful and calm. But there was something else in her expression, something Maya hadn't noticed before, a quiet strength that her mother always carried with her, even when things were difficult, even when life didn't go as planned. Maya admired that strength and wondered if she could be as brave as her mom one day. Her mother had always been there for her, always protected her, and loved her no matter what, and Maya realized that her mother's love was something that gave her courage. Even when the world felt overwhelming, her mother had always made her feel safe, even when things weren't perfect. And now Maya understood that she didn't have to face everything alone. She didn't have to carry the burden of injustice or fear by herself. She had her mom by her side. She had people who cared about her. And that made all the difference when they finally touched down. And the plane came to a complete stop. Maya felt a sense of relief wash over her. It wasn't just the end of the flight. It was the end of something else, to the end of a chapter where Maya had felt small and invisible, and the beginning of something new, the beginning of a sense of self-worth she hadn't known was possible. When the seatbelt light turned off and the passengers began to gather their things, Maya stood up slowly, stretching her arms above her head. For the first time all flight, she felt a little bit taller. She didn't feel like the same scared little girl who had boarded the plane earlier in the day. She felt like someone who had been through something difficult, but had come out the other side stronger and more aware of her own power. She turned to her mother and smiled. The world hadn't changed in that one moment, but Maya had changed, and that felt like enough for now. As they walked off the plane together, Maya felt a sense of hope growing inside her, a quiet promise to herself that no matter what happened, she wouldn't let anyone make her feel small again. She wouldn't let fear silence her voice. She didn't know where the future would take her or what challenges she would face, but she knew one thing for sure: she was capable of standing up for herself and others, just like the man had done for her on that plane. As Maya and her mother stepped off the plane and into the terminal, the bright lights and bustling crowds felt different. Somehow they felt more alive to Maya, as if everything around her had become sharper, more vibrant. She could still feel the rush of the plane's descent in her veins, still hear the hum of the engines in the back of her mind. But now it felt like a distant memory, like something that had happened to someone else, not to the girl who had been humiliated in front of everyone just hours ago. No, she wasn't that girl anymore, at least not in the same way. When they reached the baggage claim, Maya glanced up at her mother, who was already looking at her with that warm but knowing smile. It was the kind of smile that told Maya everything would be okay, that no matter what had happened, she would always have her mother by her side to hold her up when she needed it. Maya felt a wave of gratitude for her mom, a deep appreciation for how steady she had been, how calm and supportive she had remained even when Maya had been lost in the weight of what had happened. Her mother had been a silent source of strength, the kind of strength Maya could always lean on. But Maya also knew that she needed to learn to find that strength within herself. She couldn't always rely on others to speak up for her or to protect her. Sometimes she would need to face difficult situations on her own. But now she felt like she was ready. She could already feel the change within her, a quiet resolve that had been sparked by that one moment on the plane when the man had stood up for her. It wasn't just about the apology. It was about the realization that people had the power to make a difference, and that Maya wasn't helpless. She wasn't invisible. She had a voice, and she was learning to use it. Maya and her mother walked through the airport together towards the exit, and as they did so, Maya couldn't help but notice the world around her. She saw the people moving quickly and purposefully. She saw the hurried travelers glancing at their phones as they rushed to catch their next flight. And for the first time, Maya didn't feel like she was just passing through. She felt like she belonged here. She was a part of this world, a world where people could be kind and stand up for what was right, a world where her voice could matter even if it was just in small moments, like the one that had happened on the plane earlier. Maya wasn't sure exactly what her future would look like, but she knew she would no longer let fear control her. She had learned that it was okay to speak up, that it was okay to be heard, that her feelings mattered, and that no one had the right to make her feel less than she was. She didn't have to be afraid of standing out or of drawing attention to herself. Sometimes standing up for herself would be the most important thing she could do, and sometimes it would make all the difference, just like it had that day on the plane. Maya's thoughts were interrupted when they reached the exit of the terminal, and a rush of warm air greeted them. She looked up at her mom with a smile that was full of new understanding and gratitude. They were finally going to see her aunt after months of planning and talking about the trip, and Maya could feel the excitement building again. But this time, it wasn't just about the trip itself. It was about the person she was becoming, about the girl who had found her voice and wasn't afraid to use it. She was no longer defined by the shame she had felt on that plane. She was defined by her resilience, her strength, and the love and support of the people around her. The world might not always be kind, But Maya knew she had the power to stand tall. No matter what happened, she could handle whatever came next with courage. And with the knowledge that she was never alone, Maya took a deep breath. As they walked into the bright sunlight of the Florida day, her heart lighter than it had been all morning. She was ready for the next chapter, ready to face whatever came her way. And she knew she had already learned one of the most important lessons of all, that standing up for herself was the first step towards making her world a better place.